Okay, let's just jump right in and unpack this because, I mean, when you read ancient texts about a leader's household, you probably expect domestic advice, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like marriage tips or maybe some family dynamics.
Right. You expect to open the book and find this window into the private, personal life of a historical figure. We're just so conditioned to think that when a historical text shifts its focus from the battlefield or the Senate floor to the living room, it's giving us some sort of ancient marriage counseling.
But what's fascinating here is that, according to Alama Parwez, we are completely misreading these texts. We aren't looking at marriage advice at all.
Not at all.
No, we're looking at high-level political theory. We're looking at governance literature.
Which is such a massive paradigm shift. But before we even get into his specific conclusions, I think we need to understand Parwez's lens, because this isn't just a slightly different opinion on a translation. It is an entirely different methodology.
That's a great point. He isn't looking at this text through centuries of cultural tradition or folklore. His approach is fundamentally linguistic and rationalist.
Right, he kind of strips all of that away.
Exactly. He strips away the accumulated cultural baggage. So all the norms of empire, the patriarchal assumptions of later centuries, he bypasses all of that and goes straight to the root institutional meanings of the Arabic words used in the Quran.
He treats the text as a coherent, structural blueprint.
Yes, a blueprint. So when he looks at Surah Al-Ahzab, specifically verses 22 through 34, he flat out refuses to accept the premise that the text suddenly abandons its grand political narrative just to give mundane domestic reprimands.
Which makes sense. Why would it suddenly pivot to who's doing the dishes, right?
Exactly. His foundational frame is that the household of the prophet, in the context of the Medina city-state, was not a private domestic sphere. It was the public institution that actually anchored the state.
Therefore, the wives of the head of state were not private individuals.
Right. They were public figures with structural roles.
And to truly grasp the weight of that, if you're listening right now, we really have to put ourselves in the Medina of the 7th century. Specifically, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Trench, which is the historical backdrop for this whole chapter, Al-Ahzab.
And honestly, calling it a battle is almost doing it a disservice.
It really is. It was a siege, an existential, just terrifying blockade.
The source material actually describes it as an earthquake-like event. Medina was completely surrounded by a massive confederation of opposing armies.
The psychological toll of that blockade just cannot be overstated. I mean, you had an entire city trapped, food supplies dwindling to literally nothing, facing an enemy that outmatched them in every conventional military metric.
It was the ultimate test of endurance for this new system.
And Parwez uses a really evocative analogy here to describe the sociological effect of this pressure. He compares the clash of faith and opposition during this siege to a tennis match.
Which is such a brilliant way to conceptualize resilience, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, because in a tennis match, the harder the ball is hit at you, the harder you return it.
Exactly. The intense crushing pressure of the siege didn't break the core of this nascent community. It actually solidified their resolve.
While the hypocrites, the people with weak commitment to the new system, were manufacturing every excuse imaginable to flee the trenches, the core believers stood firm.
The siege essentially forced the community to prove their loyalty to the governance system under the most extreme duress imaginable.
And against all odds, they survive. The state of Medina outlasts the siege, the Confederation fractures, and the massive threat just dissipates.
But surviving doesn't just mean returning to the status quo. Because they survived this ultimate test, the geopolitical reality of the entire region shifts basically overnight.
Right, Medina goes from being this struggling, embattled settlement to a recognized, formidable power. Trade routes suddenly open up.
Spoils of war are acquired. Territory expands.
And suddenly, the state is coming into unprecedented wealth. Resources are just flowing in.
Which brings us to the real core tension of Parwez's analysis. We are moving from a state of sheer survival to a state of sudden abundance. And historically, that transition is where most nascent states collapse into corruption.
So let's look at how that abundance impacts the prophet's household specifically. If you're listening, imagine you are one of his wives. You have been living in conditions of extreme, almost unimaginable austerity for years.
The historical record paints a very stark picture. We are talking about a household where, for days or even weeks on end, a fire wasn't even lit in the stove for cooking.
They were surviving on dates and water?
Literally. They endured the absolute hardest times alongside the head of state, starving while the foundations of the state were being laid.
And now the siege is over, the state treasury is finally filling up. You look around and you see the influx of resources. You see normal citizens beginning to enjoy the fruits of this newfound security.
So you make a request. You ask for a slightly better standard of living,
Yeah, maybe some better clothing, maybe a little more food security, just a stipend that reflects the success of the state you helped build.
which is a completely normal, rational human request. They weren't asking for palaces or crowns. They were just asking for the basic comforts that were now suddenly available to the wider society.
They were asking to share in the prosperity that they had suffered so greatly to secure. I mean, if your partner's startup finally goes public after 10 years of you both eating instant noodles and draining your savings, you expect to finally fix the leaky roof. It makes total sense.
It absolutely does.
But the response they get from the prophet, the response documented in these verses, is where the concept of the leader's household gets radically redefined. He doesn't just say, no, we can't afford it, or no, we must remain humble to set a good example.
He offers them a formal binding contract, a definitive binary choice.
Right. These are verses 28 and 29, what we can call the option verses.
And this is where Parwez's political reading really gains traction, because this is clearly not a domestic squabble over a household budget.
No, this is the head of state presenting a constitutional ultimatum to the members of his institutional household.
He essentially says to his wives, if you want the life of this world and its adornments, meaning the wealth, the comfort, the upgraded standard of living you are asking for, I will release you gracefully.
I will provide for you, give you a generous settlement, and let you go without any anger or resentment. You can transition back into being private citizens and live comfortably. That is option A.
But if you want God, his messenger, and the life of the hereafter, which Parwez translates as choosing the mission, the system, and the future over present comfort, then you stay.
But, and this is the kicker, if you stay, the extreme austerity remains. The poverty-level standard of living does not change regardless of how rich the state has become.
It's a staggering condition.
And I really have to push back here because to a modern listener, this feels almost performative. I mean, if the state is genuinely wealthy now, why can't the leader's family have just a little comfort? Why is poverty a hard requirement for leadership here? It sounds like asceticism, like suffering just for the sake of looking pious.
It does sound like that at first glance, but Parwez's socioeconomic reading strips away the idea of asceticism entirely. It ceases to be about performative piety and becomes this brilliant structural safeguard against corruption.
How so?
Well, Parwez argues that in this specific governance system, the head of state's standard of living simply cannot be determined by the wealth of the treasury. It must be intimately, inextricably tied to the absolute lowest, poorest citizen in the society.
Okay, so it's an economic tether. The leader doesn't stay poor because poverty is inherently holy. The leader stays poor because there are still poor people in the state.
Precisely. If the leader's household is allowed to benefit from the state's wealth while there is still a single person in the society struggling to eat, it completely breaks the core logic of the system.
Wow, the leader must feel the exact same economic reality as the most vulnerable citizen. It forces empathy through shared reality, not just through, theoretical compassion.
But isn't that economically dangerous? Let's look at the historical anecdote Parwez uses with the later caliphs like Abu Bakr and Umar. They take over this massive empire that has defeated the Byzantines and Persians. Wealth is just flooding in.
Unbelievable wealth, yes.
And when setting their own state allowance, they peg it to the daily wage of the lowest laborer in Medina. When people ask how they can survive running an empire on minimum wage, they essentially say, if I cannot survive on it, I will raise the wages of the laborers so my allowance increases with theirs.
Yes, that is the core principle.
But my question is, if the leader artificially inflates the minimum wage just so their own household can afford a better standard of living, doesn't that risk bankrupting the state just to satisfy the leader's personal needs? That is the exact tension the system is designed to create, but it resolves it through structural focus. It's not about the leader arbitrarily decreeing a higher wage out of thin air, which would obviously cause inflation or bankrupt the treasury.
Right.
It means the entire focus of the state's economic policy must be geared toward lifting the absolute bottom of the economic ladder.
Ah, I see.
The leader cannot simply vote themselves a pay raise from the surplus. To get a pay raise, they have to implement policies that genuinely increase the real value of the lowest laborer's labor.
They have to actually build infrastructure, improve trade, ensure fair markets, and eradicate extreme poverty.
Exactly. The only way the leader can legitimately improve their own standard of living is by structurally raising the floor for the entire society. You don't get to rise while others are falling. You only rise when the bottom rises.
That reframes the prophet's response to his wives completely. He wasn't punishing them. He wasn't being cruel.
Not at all.
He was explaining the harsh physics of their political reality. He was saying, I am the head of state. My standard of living is locked to the poorest person we govern. Until their lives improve, ours simply cannot.
And he gave them a genuine guilt-free exit. If you don't want to carry that incredible burden, you can leave with dignity and resources.
Which means the women who chose to stay, and historically we know they all chose to stay, they were making a massive, conscious, political and ideological decision.
They weren't just passively accepting a husband's decision. They were consciously accepting a life of mission over a life of privilege. They opted into a governance model that demanded profound personal sacrifice.
So they've accepted this vow of poverty to anchor the state. But poverty isn't the only burden of public office, because if you hold the public trust, your mistakes aren't just your own anymore.
No, they certainly aren't.
That changes the entire mathematical equation of justice for them, which we see in the very next set of verses. This is where the concept of accountability gets dialed up to a level that is incredibly intense.
Yes, verses 30 and 31.
Right. These verses state that if anyone in this specific household commits an evident indecency, a clear violation of the law or moral code, their punishment will be doubled, twice what a normal citizen would receive. But conversely, if they do righteous deeds, their reward is doubled.
It is a perfect mathematical symmetry of consequence.
Yeah.
Double the penalty, double the reward. Parwez calls this scaled responsibility.
Let's expand on how that translates to our modern understanding of power. Because we actually have a really visceral reaction to this in our own society when public trust is broken.
We do, yeah. Think about financial crimes.
Exactly. If a random citizen with a small retirement account happens to make a lucky stock trade based on a rumor they overheard at a coffee shop, it might be legally questionable, but society doesn't collapse over it.
Right. It's a minor infraction.
But if a sitting politician or a CEO of a publicly traded company uses privileged, non-public information to dump their stock right before a market crash,
that is insider trading.
and the public outrage is massive, and rightfully so, it feels inherently worse.
Because the nature of the crime fundamentally changes based on the position of the actor. The politician isn't just breaking a financial regulation. They are weaponizing the very system they are sworn to protect.
They are extracting private value from public trust.
Exactly. The betrayal is deeper, so the societal wound is deeper. Karwis points out that this is precisely the logic the Quran is using.
And he highlights a specific phrase from the text here, right? You are not like other women.
Yes. Historically, that line has very often been read as a statement of simple superiority, like you are holier or better than everyone else.
Yeah, that's definitely the standard interpretation most people hear.
But Parwez says, no, this is a statement of structural reality. You are not like other women because you are public figures. You are the structural anchor of the state.
And this reframing is absolutely crucial. Because often when people read punishment will be doubled, it sounds punitive. It sounds like a vindictive threat directed at women.
It really does. But Parwez replaces that theological dread with institutional physics.
Institutional physics. I love that term.
It is not a threat. It is the natural, unavoidable scaling of public accountability based on public influence.
A minor slip-up by a private citizen is localized. It affects them, maybe their immediate family. It's a pebble dropped in a puddle. But a minor slip-up by a member of the head of state's household, that's a boulder dropped in a lake.
The ripples hit everyone.
If the leader's family acts with entitlement, breaks the rules, or indulges in corruption, it sends a signal to the entire society that the system is a sham. It compromises the legitimacy of the entire government.
Exactly. The damage is exponentially greater, so the deterrent must be exponentially greater. When they chose option B, they chose a life lived under a microscope where every single action carried double the weight.
They surrendered their right to be average.
They did.
They surrendered the right to make a quiet mistake. And that requirement for absolute pristine conduct brings us to what is arguably the most controversial, or at least the most fiercely debated part of this entire passage, verses 33 and 34.
Yes, we have to address the elephant in the room.
We do, because verse 33 explicitly says, stay in your homes. How do we unpack that? Because reading that plainly, how is that not just confining women?
It's the obvious question.
How is that not locking them away in a domestic prison and shutting them out of the public sphere? I mean, even with the context of them being public figures with high accountability, telling them to stay home feels entirely contradictory to the idea of them being important institutional anchors.
Right. If they are so vital to the state, why are they locked indoors?
Exactly.
This is perhaps the most critical question in Parwiz's entire analysis, and he tackles it head-on through rigorous linguistics. He goes back to the root of the Arabic word used in the verse, which is wakarna.
Okay, so how does breaking down that specific word change the meaning?
Well, the traditional translation, as you noted, often leans towards stay or remain confined. But Parwiz points out that the root of wakarna is wakar, and wakar means dignity, gravity, poise, and authority.
Okay, so it has a totally different vibe.
Exactly. It is the demeanor of a dignified custodian, a respected elder, or an authoritative figure. It is the exact opposite of frivolousness or agitation.
So the command is not a spatial restriction.
No, it is not saying do not physically cross the threshold of your front door. It is a behavioral imperative. It means reside in your position with absolute dignity and gravity.
So it's less stay in your house like a prisoner and more occupy your role with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice.
That's a perfect analogy.
I mean, you don't tell a Supreme Court justice to stay in the courthouse as a physical punishment.
Yeah.
You expect them to conduct themselves with the dignity that the courthouse represents, whether they are on the bench or at a grocery store.
Right. Their demeanor must constantly reflect the weight of the institution they represent.
It fundamentally changes the texture of the command.
It does, but Parwiz goes even further. He contrasts this command of wakarna, this dignified gravity, with the exact behavior the verse immediately forbids, which is tabaruj. The verse says, do not display yourselves as was the display of the former times of ignorance.
Okay, so what does tabaruj mean in this specific context?
Parwiz defines tabaruj as the display of beauty, specifically the objectification of oneself for the purpose of drawing attention. And to explain why this is forbidden, he uses a brilliantly vivid analogy that has absolutely nothing to do with prudishness or controlling women's bodies.
I love his analogies. What is it?
He talks about the madhani, the traditional wooden butter churner used in that part of the world.
Wait, a butter churner. Let's unpack that. How does that relate to a public display of beauty?
Think about how a churner works. You have a pot of milk. It's still. It's calm.
Okay.
To get the butter out of it, you insert this wooden instrument, the madhani, and you violently agitate the milk. You churn it, you cause turbulence, you disrupt the calm until the hidden elements are forced to the surface.
Oh, wow. So instead of the liquid being calm, it's a deliberate disruption. You're saying the display of beauty here isn't just a moral failing of vanity, it's a structural failing of causing societal turbulence.
That is exactly Parwiz's argument. He argues that tabaruj, this intentional objectifying display, acts upon society exactly like the madhani acts upon the milk.
It's mind-blowing.
By objectifying oneself, by making one's physical appearance the primary focal point of interaction, you are intentionally causing emotional and psychological turbulence in the societal environment. You are agitating the social fabric to draw out reactions.
And Parwiz is saying that a woman whose purpose is to be an intellectual equal, an institutional anchor, a person of wakar, of gravity, cannot simultaneously act as a matani.
You cannot. You cannot be the stabilizing force of a society if you're actively choosing to be the agitating force. It reduces a complex intellectual human being into a mere object of attraction whose only power is to cause disruption.
Which is why Parwiz explicitly rejects the long-held cross-cultural narrative, what is often referred to as the Adam's rib narrative, that women exist fundamentally as appendages to men.
Yes, he completely dismantles that.
The idea that women were created merely to soothe men's loneliness or to be the objects of their desire, he argues for a radical equality here.
Women are independent, complete equals in the human enterprise. They have their own intellect, their own spiritual agency, and their own massive societal responsibilities.
The prohibition against tabaruj isn't about protecting men from temptation, which is how it's almost always framed.
And which is frankly patronizing to both men and women.
Extremely patronizing. It is about demanding that women be treated and treat themselves as intellectual and public equals, not as decorative objects.
You avoid tabaruj so that your mind, your character, and your public contribution are what define you in the public square.
Exactly. It's not a restriction on freedom. It's a demand for intellectual respect. And this perfectly sets up verse 34, which is really the capstone of this entire argument. The verse says, "Remember what is recited in your homes of the verses of God and wisdom."
Yes. the living archive.
Why were they told to occupy their space with dignified gravity? Because they had a job to do, a vital state-level job. Let's spend some time on this idea of the living archive because we need to understand how oral transmission actually worked in 7th century Arabia.
We really do, because it's so different from today.
We live in a world of cloud storage and instantaneous digital search. But in a highly oral society, before mass literacy or printing presses, human memory was the database.
The only database.
The prophet's public actions were seen by thousands. If he made a ruling in the mosque or led a battle, there were plenty of witnesses. But his private conduct, how he applied the laws and the wisdom behind closed doors, how he managed the absolute smallest details of human life, who was observing that, who was recording it?
The wives. They were the sole custodians of the domestic record of prophetic conduct. And in this governance model, the private application of the law is just as critical as the public decree.
But how did citizens actually interact with this archive? Parwez points out they weren't just passively watching, they were actively instructed to remember what is recited.
Right, they had an active duty to disseminate it.
If a citizen of Medina had a nuanced legal question about inheritance or domestic dispute resolution or personal ethics, things that didn't happen in the public square, they couldn't just Google it. They couldn't go to a library.
No, they had to go to the prophet's household. They had to consult the wives.
And this highlights the mechanics of their institutional role. The wives had to possess the intellectual rigor to memorize, contextualize, and accurately transmit the principles of the system.
And if they lacked waqar, if they were frivolous or easily swayed or compromised their integrity in any way, the entire secondary database of state law would be corrupted.
Wow. So their staying in the home wasn't the sequestration of a gender at all. It was the anchoring of an institution.
It was maintaining the integrity of the central database so that the society had a reliable, uncorrupted source of truth.
It prevents defragmentation of state law entirely. If the wives are dignified custodians, their transmission is trusted implicitly by the society. When you take the command to occupy the role with gravity, wakorna, and you combine it with the duty to serve as the institutional memory, the entire narrative flips.
It really does.
These 13 verses transform from a set of restrictive domestic rules into a masterclass in establishing a resilient, accountable, and profoundly ethical governance structure.
If we distill the thesis that Parwez has laid out, it basically comes down to a fundamental law of political theory. Power cannot exist without proportional accountability.
It's that simple.
A leader's household cannot mix private benefit with their public role.
Right.
If you are going to anchor the system, you must be the most accountable person in it.
Your standard of living must reflect the reality of the people you govern.
Yes, and your conduct must be pristine because you are the custodian of the system's memory and integrity. This isn't theology at all. It is an entirely rational, socioeconomic blueprint for legitimate leadership.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It's a blueprint that demands an uncomfortable level of sacrifice from those at the top. It demands that leaders bleed with their people, both economically and socially.
It does.
It really makes you wonder, if we applied Parwez's ultimate test of legitimacy today, if a CEO, a prime minister, or a cultural leader had to legally peg their family's net worth and standard of living to the poorest, most vulnerable citizen they are responsible for.
How many would actually stay in the job?
Exactly. How many of our modern institutions would actually survive that test? Something to think about next time you read the news.